Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webcast session, How Chevron Automates Their SoD Control Process Across All Risks and All Geos with Access Violation Management. We're going to give everyone a few more minutes to filter in, and then we'll start. Okay, for those of you just joining us, welcome. I'm going to start by introducing today's panelists. Today we have Chris Hines, Internal Controls Analyst at Chevron. Chris is a member of the Internal Controls team at Chevron, and he's been with the company for 12 years, spending 2 years focusing on segregation of duties and implementations of the AVM tool. Also today from Protiviti, Rohan Bhatia, Senior Manager of Enterprise Application Solutions at Protiviti. Rohan is a member of the Enterprise Application Services team and specializes in SAP services. And finally, our own Susan Stapleton, who is Vice President, Partner Advisory at Pathlock. Susan, I'm going to hand it over to you.
All right. Thanks a lot, Nick.
Actually, sorry to interrupt. Yeah. One final thing I just want to make everyone aware of that we are going to have a Q&A at the end of the presentation. So we'd love to hear from you if you have questions, and we will be answering them. And finally, we're going to have a recorded version of the webinar on pathlock.com, hopefully tomorrow morning. So make sure to come back and take a look at the recording. Sorry, go ahead, Susan.
Thanks, Nick. So I'm super excited to have Chris and Rohan present with me today. Chevron has a great success story to share, but before I hand it over to them, I do want to touch on just a couple of topics. One is the complexity related to today's business environment that causes many challenges, but specifically we're going to be talking about complexities when it comes to managing user access, from the ability to identify risk to the mitigation of known risk when users have access to multiple systems. I also wanted to briefly give an overview of the software solution Chevron's adopted and just show you how the automation of SoD mitigation can allow the business to focus on real risk, not the potential risks that could happen due to user authorization. So in today's business environment, companies are adopting best-of-breed solutions. They may be acquiring companies that have different ERPs. They may have custom applications that are super critical to the business. There is a whole host of reasons that makes the landscape much more complex to manage than maybe it was prior. When the business adopts these best-of-breed solutions, it's likely that the business processes that your company runs, like procurement, payroll, or warehousing, are now being carried out outside of the core ERP. So while you may have had comprehensive coverage of user risk reporting in the past, business processes that were covered, like procure to pay, order to cash, inventory management, some or all of those activities have moved outside the scope of what your GRC solution can monitor from a user access or risk perspective. And of course, just because you can no longer see them in your GRC or access control solution, this does not mean that the risks have gone away. So as a first step in user access governance, it's important to have a solution that can connect real time into various business applications so you can look across systems to identify what users have access to do. And when you have one system like access control connected to all of your business applications, you can give your security, compliance, and audit stakeholders that one source of truth, one place to document and manage your master data or SOD risk for cross-system SODs. You can embed that compliance check to check all systems within your access request workflow. And you have the ability also to include all of your systems, all of your users, and all of your roles into a consistent and streamlined user access review. This can eliminate a manual and siloed approach to reviewing user access and make sure you can govern users no matter which business application your organization may be adopting. For access control customers, and I think, you know, a lot of the registration included access control customers, Pathlock, which used to be Greenlight, provides real-time integration to any system, other ERPs, clouds, and as I said before, even custom applications. We do this by normalizing security models to make sure accurate SOD reporting can happen by building very granular SOD rules across all of the systems, so you don't have to deal with false positives. This translation of the security model allows us to provide an apples-to-apples comparison to report when a user who has the activity to purchase and maybe approve POs in Ariba, and then T-codes and auth objects that allow them to pay a vendor from SAP, that those users can be identified. And they can be identified, as I said, across systems. We refer to this kind of as identifying users who can do segregation of duty activities. Comprehensive user access governance includes knowing who has access in and across systems, which can result in SOD or segregation of duties, and removing access that's not needed. But sometime during this maturity of this process, you will have a group of users who still have segregation of duties. And this is where you need to identify effective mitigating controls. So instead of developing and maintaining controls and maybe facilitating a very manual control process, Chevron has continued their user access governance automation by adopting an automated control monitoring solution. And several years ago, I worked with Chevron when I was still at SAP, and we extended out their access control to JD Edwards. And with that, they then could use that one source of truth to do their SOD reporting, their user access reviews, and so on. So what Chris and Rohan are going to talk about next is kind of maturing through that space and adopting the next step, which is automating the SODs. So auditors are really honing in this area now to ensure companies have effective controls over user risk. And achieving effective controls just within SAP is difficult, but it becomes much more difficult when the functions of a segregation of duty violation are carried out across systems. The same approach kind of on the can-do, that normalization of security models to ensure apples-to-apples comparison of authorization data, now needs to be translated at the transaction level to compare apples-to-apples in business activities in and across systems. Pathlock provides this via our ability to map to transactions in any business application, correlate transactional events back to a user, and this is how we identify real SOD transaction violations. This is where we can identify when the same user creates a purchase order and pays the vendor for that same purchase order, even if those activities are in different systems. I refer to this again as the can-do versus did-do. Access control and other GRC solutions will tell you who has access to do what. And this is important to understand, no question. You need to remove excessive access or inappropriate access or not allow critical segregation of duty violation access. But when you have to allow SODs, we can automate the controls looking at 100% of the transactions that occur in the business application and comb through and identify of all of the users who can do segregation of duties, which users did perform an actual segregation of duty violation. And we automate this so that when we do identify user risk, actual violations, we can send that out to the business to review just the exceptions versus putting a wide-ranging control in place to monitor all users and look across or sample all transactions. So I'm going to show you just a few screens so that it's kind of sets a clearer picture of what Chris and Rohan are going to talk about. But this is the actual solution. And at Chevron, they schedule controls to run on a periodic basis across multiple systems. And then when they identify a violation, the business owner or risk owner will get a notice in their inbox that they have SODs to be reviewed. They will receive a work list, and in that work list, every SOD violation is correlated or aligned in one line, meaning this user created an invoice for the same goods receipt that they received into the warehouse. So here you can see the pertinent information that needs to be reviewed and signed off on. And this is the user created an invoice, again, for the same goods receipt into the warehouse, the dollar value of that transaction, the material document number of the receipt, very detailed transactional information correlated and reported in this report. As the risk owner reviews this data, they can ensure there's not inappropriate or fraudulent activity happening, and they can mark these records as reviewed and move them into the closed status. And while this is meant to be a comprehensive detective control for known risks, it's really not a fraud management solution. We really are just monitoring risky access and presenting data to the business to review and sign off on. And this is the mitigation control at this point. After they've reviewed it, moved it into closed, they have actually performed their mitigation control for this cycle. And because the business transactions almost always have a dollar value associated, we can quantify all of the risk and report them out for the entire organization. This is just an example of one of the dashboards that is available, but this gives you so much transparency into what's happening. You can see the total financial exposure related to SoD risk, and you can see it month over month, quarter over quarter. You can see the top users and the top risks that are transpiring within the organization. And you can see within which business processes the SoD activities are happening. In another dashboard, you can monitor from the review cycle, how many exceptions were identified, how many have been reviewed, how many are outstanding. This provides kind of a central repository for the internal controls team to monitor the mitigation process. All of this is online, managed with workflows, reminders, escalations, complete audit trails. And Chris and Rohan are going to talk a little bit more about this automation and kind of how low touch it can be. And you know what? Enough for me. Chris and Rohan are about the Chevrons Journey and how they adopted this automated mitigation. And I'm going to turn it over to Chris.
Thanks, Susan. So as mentioned earlier, my name is Chris Hines. I work in the internal controls department at Chevron, and we're responsible for the SOX program, administration of that program. And one of the key areas that we focus on is related to SOD review. So just to give you some background into the size of the company, just so you can see how complex it can be to do this process, comparing it to the prior manual process that we had in place versus what we're able to see from going through the AVM solution. So we have a large amount of revenue. We're at almost 140 billion in 2019. For our size of operations, we operate in over 50 countries with over 48,000 employees, and we have close to 150-year history of being in business. And so, as you can see, with those number of locations and the amount of employees that we have in place, there is quite a bit of variance involved in the process, at least before we implemented AVM. So we do have, in location, we'd have compliance coordinators that would support the business units. We had roughly 100 people that would be doing that spread across the company. And they would basically need to create the reports and provide that information to supervisors for them to perform their review. And then also those compliance coordinators, they work with people at a more corporate level that support the reporting units. And there's roughly 10 or so people that are involved in that process. And then internal controls, which is the team that I'm a part of, we support them. So there are a lot of layers involved in the review process, and we had a lot of variance as far as how the reports are done in one location versus another location. So there's a lot of complexity involved with the overall process before we were able to find an automated solution. Oops. I think, Rohan, you're going to go ahead and provide some of the value drivers that we saw when going through this process.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. I guess just to quickly reiterate my intro that Nick touched on in the beginning, Rohan Bhatia, Senior Manager with Protiviti, and I was kind of the day-to-day manager for Protiviti as part of this AVM implementation for Chevron, working alongside Chris and his team. And so when we think through some of the initial value drivers that Chevron had, before we even started the process, just in terms of kind of an initial POC we did, which Chris will touch on a little bit in a later slide, and just thinking through how to go from that previous very manual process that Chris was just describing to a more automated, comprehensive, standardized process moving forward. I'm probably going to harken back to a lot of the things that Chris and Susan were talking about on the previous slides, because a lot of those ring true for Chevron here. So just starting at the top there, you can see that we implemented about 50 or so SOD risks within the PathLock AVM solution across multiple types of systems, and within each one of those types of ERP or other systems, I think there was several separate instances within that as well. So just again, going back to the complexity of Chevron in particular, but also as Susan touched on in the beginning, most large organizations this day will be dealing with that type of level of complexity, even if it's not necessarily quite to the level of Chevron. But you've got data that exists in several ERP or other systems where there's a user access risk that needs to be monitored. So for Chevron in particular, we had 50 risks, as I mentioned, across SAP, JDE, so two kind of core standard ERP type systems, as well as Ariba, the procurement system as well. Moving on to some of the points here in terms of the specific drivers on the bottom of the slide. So obviously, greatly reducing the overall risk exposure. So as Susan touched on before, there's a difference between the kind of user risk analysis we do in SAP GRC Access Control, which is a great starting point. But that's really focusing on, access-based, what we would call potential risks, as Susan touched on, but not on the actual, true transactional risks of what users actually performed in the system. So, that was a key piece in reducing the overall risk exposure for Chevron and in replacing the previous manual process. Some of the reports that Susan showed examples of in the previous slide. And then, having a centralized repository as well of all of that data, centralized kind of paper trail, if you will, not only for Chevron management and the internal controls team, but ultimately for the external auditor as well. There's I think a more and more refined lens being put on user access as part of overall SOX programs that external auditors are looking for. So AVM really helps standardize a lot of that and have it in kind of one source of truth, one system of record. Highly effective control coverage as well. So it's just the fact that now, and this kind of bleeds into the next section as well in terms of transparency. Chevron was able now with AVM, through having an automated solution and not having to do this manually, to get visibility into the whole universe of SOD risks that were being transacted on within the organization, for the risks that we set up, obviously, as opposed to having to do that on a sample basis as they did before, just due to the level of manual work involved in compiling those reports manually out of the various systems. Also in the middle section there on the second bullet, you'll notice the automated triggers and notifications to facilitate the actual review. Now Chevron's doing this on a semi-annual basis. You certainly have the ability with AVM to do it a bit more frequently if you'd like, to give yourself and your organization kind of a more real-time visibility into risk, on that point of transparency. And then the financial impact as well. Again, Susan touched on this. So now, and this is, I think, a big difference is transactional elements of, what people actually did with an SOD violation as opposed to purely the access-based elements that you would get out of GRC. You can actually associate a dollar value with the majority of those, right? So anytime there's an actual transactional element involved that, involves a dollar figure, for example, updating a vendor master record and then paying the vendor, there's a dollar figure associated with that payment that can be quantified and ultimately aggregated up to, to kind of show your overall SOD financial exposure. So these were all some of the key drivers, probably for any organization that's going to do an AVM type project, but certainly for Chevron. And I know, Chris, there were some more points you wanted to add on the business ownership and action there on the last column on the right.
Yeah, sure. So I can give some specific examples of things that we've been able to see from just experiencing the implementation and being able to use AVM for the last 2 years or so, one of the things I think that we see a lot of is now that supervisors have more visibility into the reviews that they're doing, they are taking more time to carefully look at that and understand where the SOD risks are coming from. So I do get a lot of questions from people trying to understand what the risk is, where it's resulting from. Is there a way they can prevent that risk from even being in place? And then that way they're reducing the overall review that they're needing to do. Also, just thinking of audit, I think that's created a lot of efficiencies for us as far as just having the tool available for our external auditors or internal auditors to be able to run the reports that they need to and get all the data that they need to get, instead of trying to go through all these various compliance coordinators that we have in place and trying to ask them for the support and hoping that they have that information available. And since it's all standardized, we're all doing the same process, the auditors are more familiar with how the tool works and the information that they're looking at. And then also finally, just related to our testing of the control related to the SOD review. So previously we were doing that actually at a local level. So going back to my comments about having this over 50 locations, we were testing the control 50 different times. So now that we were able to standardize the process and have it be one single system that we're utilizing, we're able to test that on just a singular basis at a corporate level now, which has eliminated a lot of SOX testing related to SODs. So that's been a huge benefit that we've seen from implementing AVM. So just continuing on as far as talking about how the SOD workflow and review works for us at Chevron, and this is related to some of what Susan was talking about earlier, is we do first of all have the access review, where it's just identifying the individuals that have SAP JDE or Ariba access in place, asking them to look at those accesses and determine whether it needs to be kept or removed. So whether they need to retain the access or remove the access. And then from there, that information does feed into AVM. So those users that are actually having the SOD conflicts in place, the actual transactions they're creating are going through AVM and going through that compensating control and looking at all those transactions in AVM, making sure that that review is done by the supervisors, and then all the evidence of that performance of the review is retained in the system. Which, to my comments just before, it does allow for that single source of information for the external auditors to be able to perform their review and make sure that the SOD review is being done completely by all of our supervisors within the company.
Yeah, and just to add to what you covered there, Chris, and kind of focusing on the bottom part of what's covered in the slide here. You guys can see the the SOD review workflow that Chris just walked through there in the chevrons, no pun intended, above. But in terms of a point we had made before, and just to bring that back here to show how it works out for Chevron specifically, AVM is really building on what SAP GRC access control is doing, right? As part of the output from GRC that feeds into AVM and allows AVM to facilitate that look-back control piece of this, that transactional analysis. And one thing I'll mention here as well is, and I think Susan mentioned before that it sounds like a lot of the folks on the line today are current GRC customers. So that's great. If a lot of you, already have access control, this will be a pretty seamless integration if you were to, to implement AVM to basically bolt it onto your current access control solution. And ultimately what it'll do is it'll take that user risk data that you're already looking at, again, based on the access the users have from access control, and feed that into AVM to do the actual transactional look back analysis. So in that way, these two systems really complement one another, and AVM is really building on kind of that baseline user access risk analysis that's already taking place in GRC. And I will say too, if you don't have SAP GRC today, maybe that's in your roadmap in the future. But even if it's not, it is also possible. I'll just note that here to get user risk data in AVM other ways as well. I've seen that with other projects. So certainly great if you have access control, but if not, it's not the end of the world if you want to do this type of look back transactional SOD analysis. So Just wanted to note that as well. All right, so here we've got a scary looking landscape diagram, but before we scare any of you away from from this slide, really what we wanted to do here was just kind of, and again, it kind of harkens back to the complexity of the organization that Chris was going over before, and kind of shows you all how the various elements of this process interplay with one another, right? So we just touched on in the previous slide the fact that AVM really is kind of building upon what GRC access control is already doing. So you can kind of see there in the flow that GRC is sending the SODs that users have along with that actual SOD rule set to AVM as an input, so that AVM can take all of that from a user access risk perspective as one of its input to do what it needs to do for its transactional look back analysis. Now there's obviously other inputs as well. So on the right side of the slide here, you see all the various source systems. As we touched on before, for Chevron, there's SAP, of course, JDE, as well as Chevron also has Ariba, which for those who aren't familiar is a procurement system, a procurement bolt-on to SAP. And even going a step beyond that, I mean, it's not totally represented in the diagram here. You just kind of see the one box for each, but if you can see in the text there that's under each one of those pictures, there's actually 5 SAP production environments that Chevron has, 28 for JDE, and then 18 separate partitions for Ariba that kind of map to some of the other various SAP and JDE instances. And so what we did here was set up AVM to ingest the relevant transactional data for those 50 SOD risks in question in order to perform the analysis that it needed to perform to say, hey, this user did edit a vendor master and pay that vendor, or for any of the other 49 risks that we set up. And so all that risk logic, just to bring this kind of back full circle, all that risk logic in terms of calculating, how to determine if somebody has violated a risk exists in AVM. It's pulling kind of that user risk data from GRC, and it's pulling the associated transactional and master data elements from the source systems on the right there. For SAP and JDE, we had some standard AVM functions installed in those systems so that it could pull the relevant data that it needed to from those. And then from Ariba on the bottom right, this was actually kind of cool and involves some customization. You can see there's actually a second box that shows ReadDB. So that's actually a procurement data warehouse that Chevron has that's sourcing data from Ariba as well as some other systems. And so we actually built out a little bit hard to read there, but we actually built out an API working with the Pathlock team to pull the relevant procurement data from that data warehouse also into AVM, along with the JDE and ECC data. So combining all that elements is kind of everything that AVM needs to then go off and do its job and report back on risk violations. I'll also quickly note in the bottom left-hand side of the slide, you'll see some stuff with Microsoft Exchange, VDS. So what this is really showing you is, I'm sure many of you can guess what the Microsoft Exchange piece is, the integration to Chevron's Exchange server to kind of facilitate the automated email notifications going out to supervisors. So again, in the spirit of fully automating this process, when risks are generated in AVM, those folks that need to do the reviews, because at the end of the day, a human being still needs to go in there and say, yes, this violation was inappropriate, or maybe it was appropriate. That's facilitated through the email notifications. And the VDS piece is really important there as well, because that's actually Chevron's HR system, similar to an AD type system to sync all the user to supervisor data, so that the user risk reports that are being generated are being sent to the right supervisors for those given users. So, and Chris, I think you had maybe some numbers on that from the last round that you wanted to share, just to give a sense of the the scale that we're working with at Chevron.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, just to give everyone a sense of the transactional review, we had roughly 600,000 transactions for our second round review. That's done from July through December transactions in 2020. And also we had some added complexity as well with a good number of supervisors that were moving different to different roles in that time period as well. So specifically talking about that bottom left that Rohan just highlighted, having that process automated to connect directly to our HR systems and get those emails sent out, it removed a lot of legwork on the compliance side as far as trying to identify who the right person would be to perform a review and making sure that they're getting the notifications needed to be able to perform their review. So that was something that you might not think about as far as the process itself, but it's a huge help to have that in place. All right, so to continue on and just give you a sense of kind of what Chevron's journey has been on this process, and also just to exemplify that it's a continuous process as well. It's not something that you need to go in and have completed within 6 months, depending on the complexity of your organization. It can take some time, but also there are things that can go in place that can be done quickly as well. So for Chevron, for us, the process and the thought behind identifying AVM as the solution that we utilized, it started in 2017, going through our proof of concept. And basically what we did was evaluate options to see what the one that suited us best for our needs was, and AVM came out to be the solution that we felt was best suited to perform our AVM review. And during that time as well, we were working with Protiviti to go through implementing that process as far as the proof of concept. So once we decided that AVM was the solution that we wanted to select, the first step that we went through was in 2018. And this is an important step that I would highlight to everybody is going through a review of your SoD rule set. So that way we're looking through it, identifying if what we have in place is appropriate to carry forward and implement into the system. And going through that process, we're able to identify some new risks that maybe we hadn't identified previously, as well as get rid of some that are no longer relevant to the environment going forward. So from there, we were able to actually start implementing the tool, and we started with a small go live specifically related to SAP, and that was done in the second half of 2018. So we selected a small organization that I believe implemented 5 risks at the time, and they had a history of having some challenges or issues in their prior manual SoD review process. So they were eager to participate in the initial go live. So in that process, we went through that, provided training material, provided support to the supervisors that were being onboarded at that point, used that as the initial starting off point to make sure that we're going towards the path that we're expecting as far as being able to implement the remainder of the risks that we need to have in place. So after that initial go live, we moved in the first half of 2019 to the full SAP go live. So that was implementing all the SAP risks across the company. And in that process as well, we were able to leverage some of the things we did in the first limited go live with the training materials that we had available as far as how to use the system, providing quick reference guides, recording those trainings, and also having that material available on our website so that people had the support they needed to be able to understand how to utilize the tool. So the SAP go live went well as well. And then we moved towards the JDE Ariba go live, which is in the second half of 2019. And based on what Rohan had just mentioned, the Ariba and JDE risks had a little bit more complexity than the SAP. So that's why we left that for the last part of the process. But for Chevron, because of the complexity of how many risks we have in place and the volume of people in our company, it made sense to break things out in this way, as far as starting with a limited go live, moving to SAP, and then going to JDE. And it also helped us as well to be able to utilize the things that we were learning on each step, as far as what are the common questions we're getting, what support do we need to provide, and how many trainings or reference materials or communications we need to provide out to the users to make sure they're understanding how to go through the review process in AVM. Is there anything else you wanted to add to this one, Rohan, about your experience of going through the the journey with us?
No, I was going to say, I think you covered it well, Chris. I would just reiterate one of the points you made. You know, when you look at this this slide here, you see that we started with the POC in 2017, the final go live, and I say final with a bit of a caveat because there's the arrow there at the end, which signifies, you know, that more functionality can always and likely, you know, probably will be rolled out in the future within AVM. But when you see that 2017 to 2019 timeline, it's like, oh, it's, you know, that's 2 years. That's pretty long. That's the length of, you know, like an ERP implementation or something like that. But as Chris kind of eloquently described here, we really, you know, it took that long to get 50 risks implemented across, you know, all these various systems with, you know, some of those risks involving customization, as Chris touched on. But really, we had kind of milestones and wins along the way that those circles there denote, in terms of getting functionality up and running and usable and operational for Chevron's, you know, organization and internal controls team, much before the end of 2019. So, and one point I'll note there as well is you know, if you're an organization running SAP, you know, Pathlock's got a lot of great standardized SAP risk content already out there, and that's a lot of the stuff that we were able to implement really quickly up front. And then just to reiterate Chris's point, you know, with Ariba and JDE, there was a bit more customization required, you know, in that API connector for Ariba that I mentioned before, as well as, you know, just in the actual risks themselves for some of those systems. So those, you know, took a little bit longer, which is why they were at the tail end here. But, you know, we were really able to realize value, you know, much earlier in the process. So, and like I said, the arrow there at the end kind of denotes that it continues on from here. And, you know, there's definitely the potential to add more to what's already there.
Correct.
Yeah, and I'll cover this slide here, Chris. So, you know, we wanted to, with this slide, just kind of bring, you know, all these examples that we're talking about. You know, when you have a webinar like this, it all kind of sounds great. We're kind of walking you through the process for Chevron, but you know, in terms of getting into the actual nitty gritty of, okay, what is the true value I could see with, you know, with one or a few of these risks in particular, we thought we'd kind of hopefully bring that to life a little bit more by talking through a specific example here, and kind of what it looked like, you know, in the previous manual process, and then what it looked like in the automated process with AVM after the implementation. So we've touched on Ariba and then SAP and JDE at this point. There were several risks in Chevron's SoD rule set that involved, you know, the creation of the purchase requisition in the Ariba system. Again, that's their procurement system. And then kind of the downstream P2P activities after the requisition taking place in the associated ERP systems, SAP and JDE. So both of those ERPs were interacting with requisitions created in Ariba. And so when you think of those downstream transactions, right, for anyone who's familiar with standard procurement process, you've got your PO creation after the PR, you've got the goods receipt, you've ultimately got the, you know, the vendor invoice, the AP payment, et cetera, right? So in doing that in the previous manual process, you know, just compiling the data to do the analysis, to do the SOD analysis, was a lot of work in and of itself, right? So the various folks at Chevron in different locations that were helping out with this had to, you know, pull that PR information from Ariba, then go to SAP or JDE and pull the associated information for all those downstream transactions, the PO, the goods receipt, et cetera. And, you know, some people may have wrote some scripts or things like that to automate pieces of this, but the point really is that it was very decentralized, that folks were doing it slightly differently in different locations. And, you know, as Chris touched on before, and as everyone probably knows, Chevron's in many different countries. So we saw, you know, for example, with this one, some differences in a couple of different South American countries and in European countries in terms of how they were doing this. So a lack of kind of standardization was certainly one thing. The manual nature of it in terms of the work having to go in to pull the reports every time they needed to run the analysis was a second piece. And then thirdly, you know, the actual accuracy component we noticed as we went through some of these, you know, for some risks in the manual process, it was better than others, but you know, and that's certainly no fault of Chevron. It's really hard to manage something like this and have, a very high level of accuracy, when you're doing this for such a large volume of data over several or many different risks. So, one of the things we noticed with this risk set in particular from an accuracy perspective when we dove into it was, for the PR approval piece of it, there were multiple levels to PR approvals based on the threshold of the requisition, right? So and I'm sure many companies out there have a very similar kind of setup. If it's a $1 purchase requisition, it probably doesn't need an approval. But if it's 100 or 1,000 or all the way on up, there's different approvals that are needed. So ultimately, from an SOD perspective, the person who's truly responsible for that requisition going through is the final approver. And so we kind of noticed that as we dug into the design for these risks that, hey, there's really 3 or 4 or 5 different columns, approver columns that we need to be pulling from that procurement warehouse, which is housing the Ariba data, in order to truly monitor this risk correctly. And that was something, again, that was being maybe done in some places, maybe not as much in other places. But through this implementation, we were able to really get into that level of nitty-gritty detail and kind of tighten that process to make sure not only are we automating it, not only are we standardizing it, but we're actually hopefully in several instances adding a level of accuracy to it, that was a little tighter than before. And just to state the obvious, that's obviously a good to do just from a risk mitigation perspective, but also when you start getting questions from your external auditors in terms of how are these risks designed, what are you truly doing from a logic perspective to make sure this risk is effectively mitigated. It's good to be able to answer that question very thoroughly. So that was another benefit we saw as we went through the process. This was just an example with a few of the procurement risks. We saw similar things with a lot of the other risks that we looked at. They weren't all cross systems. Some were only within SAP, some only within JDE, but these kind of themes, were relevant throughout.
And I think just to carry on with some of those points that Rohan was just making, the next few slides are to compare what the manual process is that we used to perform versus what the automated process is now, and probably hopefully be able to just show how it's simplified the process quite a bit on our end. So first off, just to focus on how we actually define the risks and the review that we're doing as far as creating those reports under our previous manual process. We'd have to identify the risks themselves and work it through that as far as the definition with our compliance groups and our assessors, making sure that we're understanding which risks are out there and what needs to be included in any of the reports. So that could be through a standard SAP report, for example, but also given the various systems that we use, there's also a lot of custom queries that would need to be made and created. And then those reports would need to be manually done as well and created. So our compliance coordinators, they need to actually review those reports, make sure they're complete, it's including all the data, and then actually getting all that information ready so that the supervisors are able to complete their review and look at the transactions they need to. So there's a lot of manual work involved with that as far as just understanding the activity that needs to take place, creating those reports, and going through that process. And that's being done on an each round review basis to make sure that we have those reports correctly identified. And then when we look at the actual SoD transaction review, the mitigating control. So the process that was in place with our manual process is identifying all the users coming directly from GRC AC to identify who has the ability to create SoD transactions, and then getting that information directly from SAP, JDE, and Ariba. And then our compliance coordinators are utilizing those reports and identifying those individuals, and basically they're needing to create SoD reports that need to be provided to our supervisors for their review. And some of the issues that we noticed with those reports, or just thinking about the comparison to the automated solution. So those reports could include true SoD violations where there actually is something that needs to be reviewed. There also could be situations where there's transactions in there that do not have an SOD violation. And then the last two that really are the areas I think that were issues before that have been remediated by having AVM in place. First off is having false positives. So items that are included in the reports that actually aren't SOD transactions needing review. So the supervisors were looking at things that they didn't need to take time to look over. And then also, alternatively, having missed events. So transactions that should have been reviewed and included in the reports that are created, and not having those and having that missed as part of the review. So that's an area where AVM is able to identify those. So those are two key areas, at least when we're talking about the manual process, where we're getting results that we shouldn't be, but also missing some of the things that we should be looking at. So that's a really important part of where we're able to fix the process or improve the process. And then as you can see, just continuing on with the actual work that's needing to be done, and kind of what we were mentioning earlier a little bit, is the reviewers going through the process of actually looking through this, needing to investigate any issues if they are identifying SOD violations that are done inappropriately, making sure that all this documentation is maintained and stored locally, and then being able to provide that information to our auditors and SOX testers. So there's a lot of manual work involved there as far as creating the reports, providing those reports for review, and then having the audit team come in afterwards to look at that information. So to compare these with the automated process that we are now going through, first off, just with defining the risks themselves, it's a one-time process. We're not going through that every single round. We do start out with the process of just identifying which risks are out there and having a defined rule set. And then the compliance coordinators work through that with internal controls, as well as our SOD governance board, which is basically making sure that we have agreement on what needs to be included in our reviews. And then we're going through with our IT support to just configure those risks in AVM and validating that the information provided is appropriate and complete. But once we've done that and defined those rules and implemented it into AVM, there's no further work that needs to be done unless we're going to continue to add additional risks. And then just comparing our monitoring process, as you can see, GRC AC and SAP JDE and Ariba, the information is being pulled as far as the users and the transactions. 100% of that information is being fed into AVM, and AVM is identifying if there are SOD violations that need to be reviewed, or if there are no violations, and the proof of that is maintained in AVM. So if there are SOD violations, it's going directly to the supervisor through that email notification, so they'll be notified that they have a review to do, and they can go directly into the AVM application from that email so that they can perform their review and review all the transactions that are assigned to them for their users. So that really cuts down on the manual work that we were talking about in the previous slide. And then also, I mentioned it a few times, but the audit documentation being solely stored in AVM, it's much more easy for the auditors to go into that system, be able to run the reports that they need to run, and be able to review all the transactions that they include as part of their testing on their end. So it's really simplifying the process and keeping everything in one single source instead of going through all these various manual processes that we previously had experienced in our old process before AVM. So as far as some of the things that Chevron's experienced or learned throughout this process, the first thing related to just obtaining input from our users and our stakeholders early. So we really went through the process and made sure, kind of to that example that Rohan talked about a few slides ago, that we are understanding and working with the business to make sure that we're correctly identifying the risks. Also making sure that we receive input on the tool itself so that we understand where questions are arising or where things are that we maybe can provide more support on, and making sure that we have all the tools available to our supervisors to be able to perform their reviews. So talking again about those training materials, recorded trainings that we have where it's a demo to show how to use the tool, having that resource available for everyone and providing that information to them, it's very useful to have that available, because we always have new supervisors, we have people changing roles. So there are always going to be people unfamiliar with how to utilize the tool. So having those resources available, it's really useful to make sure that they're able to understand the process. The process improvement, I think we touched on this a little bit in the journey discussion, but AVM for us it's a continuous process, and we're always looking into ways that we can add systems or add risks and make sure that we're automating as much as possible of the SOD process to make sure it is a more standard process. And also back to my discussion a little bit about the SOD governance that we have in place too. That's another area where we've, as far as our ownership of AVM, we've been able to be taking part in that SOD governance board to provide them with updates as far as what AVM is capable of doing, any changes or enhancements to our process overall, so that we're making sure that we're getting a full picture into the SOD environment within Chevron. And then finally, just leveraging the technology to fit our organization. So for us, we are certainly on a journey as far as trying to identify solutions where we can automate more of the processes that we're doing. And I think so going through this process, specifically related to controls, it does help us identify things that maybe we weren't aware of before, just overall as far as the view into the SOD violations that are out there, but also just to continuously improve our processes and make sure that we have automated solutions in place for a lot of the controls that we have. So this is, for us, it was one of the big starts on that journey. But I definitely think that it's been a huge benefit to us as a whole and made sure that we have much more accuracy and visibility into the process as a whole.
Okay, awesome. I think I take over from here. I'm going to just real quickly go over just a couple of slides and wrap this up so we have time for questions. But thank you so much, Chris and Rohan. I thought that was awesome. Really, I just wanted to wrap up here and say, you know, with good GRC solutions that can attach or connect to all of your critical business applications, you can have that one source of truth to manage all of your systems, all of your users against all of your risks, and really have that centralized repository internally and externally. I think Chevron has done an awesome job also of really bringing the business along. They were very mature in this process anyway. When AVM came on board, the business was very active in the control process. But even if your business isn't active in the control process, providing this automation, providing just the area to focus on when you send out reporting to the business can help bring them on board. So I think it's just valuable that, you know, the access violation management solution can give you that workflow. All of the data is online. The data is fetched online, correlated online with the rules, reviewed and actioned online. Means there's no ability to miss things, manipulate data. And when the controls are executed, you know, we're doing the control the same way for all users, all risk, no matter how many risk owners or different geographical locations these controls have to run against. And as Chris said, you know, not only for the business and the internal controls team, but also provides a lot of value from the external audit side to test one time, because these things are streamlined and running consistently all across the board. And then this last piece, the valuable insight you get and that the business now is really paying attention to, and even coming to you, Chris, when they want to maybe reduce the amount of transactions they're reviewing or figure out which roles to assign to a user to reduce risk. That's a key piece here as well. So I want to leave time for questions, and I think I'll turn it back over to Nick here and see if we got any questions that came in.
Yeah, absolutely, Susan, and thank you guys. You did a terrific job. So here we go. First question we have: do you need to create your own risks, or do you only use the ones from PathLock? So there was a mention of 50, I think, here.
Right, so some of those were standard risks, but we also, at least in Chevron, have a lot of our own custom risks that we were able to work with PathLock on to get implemented and created.
Okay, are your access reviews performed by role permission owners, if that is defined, or is it performed by a user's direct line manager? I think that may be for Susan.
Well, I think that's probably for Chris, and probably subsequently answered that during the talking. But at Chevron, it's the user's direct supervisor who gets the reports and needs to do that review, right, Chris?
That's correct. Yeah, it'd be the direct supervisor.
Okay, thanks. And I'm not sure if this is in reference to, someone asked if Ariba is a cloud product. So, I mean, I think I can answer that by saying that it is cloud-based, but beyond that, I don't know if we can expand on that. So the next one.
Well, I would just say some of our customers still have Ariba on-prem because it was an on-prem model before it went to cloud. And I actually think, I don't remember, Chris, was Ariba on-prem at some point at Chevron and went to cloud?
That's correct.
I don't remember. Yeah. I think we were monitoring the on-prem version, but now it's the cloud-based Ariba version.
Yes, that's correct.
Okay, got it. All right. Next question. Does AVM need any data from an IDM in order to identify a user in all these different systems?
You want me to take that? Does it need it does not. AVM can do user mapping across systems if the users have different IDs. But it is best. I do think the more automation you can identify, the better. So if you can associate AVM users and risk to an external application that provides the risk owner or who needs to do the review, so much the better. If not, there's a lot of mapping that can be done within AVM itself. Users to risk to geographical locations can identify the correct risk owner and so on. I hope that answers, but there's a lot of options on how that can be done.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, the next question. It looks like Chevron IT owns the PathLock solution. As far as Protiviti, I think this, Rohan, is for you. Is that typical, or does the business own it usually?
Yeah, and I think, and I guess Chris, Chevron, I guess the IT organization does own the application at Chevron, although the internal controls team as well is maybe a co-owner in a way, Chris, although it might officially fall under IT. But in terms of the question, I think, I think it can go either way. I think from what we see typically, yeah, it some of the time is falls within the IT organization. Other times it's likely going to fall within, some area of the business, or maybe kind of adjacent to the business, something like internal audit, internal controls in Chris's case. Those are kind of a lot of the typical areas of ownership I think you'd see. And again, just to touch on, even though it might not fall under necessarily business ownership, although it potentially could as well under finance or something like that, the business is going to be very involved using the tool in the case of Chevron as the supervisors, as Chris mentioned, in terms of actually doing the review and all those types of things. So even if it's not necessarily explicit business ownership, they will certainly be a key stakeholder, folks from different parts of the business. So hopefully that helps give a little clarity.
Thanks, Ryan. Okay, how long do the did-do reports run? I would imagine a long period of time, since it is looking at stat data. Does it show what they did for a specific company, code, sales, organization, plant? I create an invoice for company A, but goods receipt in a different company. Hopefully you can decipher that.
Yeah. I can maybe, or Susan, did you want to grab that one?
I would just say it absolutely looks at the organizational values to make sure that if you created a PO for company A, that you receive goods for company A. It's not going to report if it's company B. And I'll turn over to you guys to talk about how long these reports run.
Yeah, and I was even going to build on that, Susan, and say if a lot of the standard risks, like Susan said, they go down to that granular level of organizational elements, and you can add to that and make your risk logic really whatever you want it to be. You can make it looser, tighter, however you want to do it. Certainly company codes, plan codes, all that can be a part of that. In terms of how long the risks run, I think Chris, for the most part, I don't remember the exact run times anymore, but I think for the most part, beyond some of the very intensive ones we saw, I think, from the finance application, most of them were fairly quick, probably within a few minutes or something like that, even for half a year's worth of data. And there were those exception cases that ran a bit longer, but not sure if you've got any more insight into that, Chris, or anything different.
Yeah, no, I would agree. I think just to add on that, that you can break the jobs up as far as the timeframes you're running it for. So some of the bigger risks, then you can run them more frequently so that you're not doing a full 6 months at one time.
Great, thank you. Yeah,
Exactly.
we've got a few more questions here. I want to make sure that we're doing this within time. Next question, do we need to turn on change history for all SOD relevant transactions in order to capture the did-do data?
I'll answer. No, I mean, we're just going directly into the purchasing tables, the goods receipts tables. All of that data is there. There is no additional tracking or logging that's ever had to be turned on at a customer location to just go fetch that transactional information that's already in your system.
Great, thanks, Susan. How does AVM quantify risk? As in, how does it come up with the dollar value?
You want me to take, I can take that. So it takes a look at, you know, what's the data, or what's the amount of the payment, what's the amount of the receipt of the goods. It takes the ultimate dollar value of kind of what's money coming in or leaving the company based on that transaction. We also fetch your currency conversion tables. So if you are a global company, we are converting all of that data back into a consistent, either a global currency or a local currency, however you want to report that out. But we are very accurate in how we report that financial exposure number. It's pretty granular how we get down to that.
Thanks, Susan. Okay, next question. What is the advantage of using AVM over identity access governance?
Well, identity access governance is the equivalent really to access control. AVM is really more here transaction monitoring, which is not part of IAG. Some customers that have access control use what they call an IAG bridge if they want to connect to an SAP solution. But that bridge doesn't connect to things like JD Edwards or the Ariba database in Chevron's example. So there's limited uses where you could use that IAG bridge to bring SAP cloud data back to access control just for the can-do analysis. IAG has nothing to do with the did-do activity monitoring that we're doing.
Thanks. We have time for two more. Next one, Chevron has SAP access control. Must we have SAP and/or access control to use PathLock?
No, we do leverage access control where customers have it to pull over certain information, but customers, we have a few customers that have no GRC solution. They just want to monitor what users are doing, and we don't require a GRC solution or an access control solution for that. I think Rohan alluded to it. You can load your own risk directly into access violation management if you want to.
Exactly. Yep.
Okay, Nick, I think we're going to have to take any additional ones offline as we're up against the hour here.
Okay, that's fine. I just want to thank everyone for joining today and to thank our panelists. We will have the full webinar available on our website tomorrow morning, so please come and visit pathlock.com. Yeah, thank you again.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.